democracy on the line.
They don't want to talk about how they want to deem any parent who has a strong opinion about their child's education as domestic terrorists. They don't want to talk about how they did everything they could to blunt our questions into voting integrity.
I'm Todd Zwillich, and this is Breaking the Vote. Here's a hard fact. Something around 35% of Americans believe that Joe Biden wasn't legitimately elected president. Make that universe just Republicans, and the number is closer to 70%. After the election of 2020, after all the failed court cases, after the attempted coup and possible criminal charges right around the corner, still, 7 out of 10 people you meet who call themselves a Republican think the election was stolen. There's never been any real evidence for it. It's hard to get your head around the idea that the lies of one man have permeated the culture so deeply. But it's a fact that we can't ignore if we want to get out of this mess. It's tempting to pin all of this on Trump. But in reality, the problem of authoritarianism, conspiracy theories, and political violence go way, way deeper than him. Trust in institutions of democracy was already shaky before Donald Trump started kicking the legs out. Community spaces of common ground were already going by the wayside and getting replaced by political identity. The internet was already helping divide and sort us with algorithms that make outrage and division a lot more profitable than goodwill. And here's a hard fact. Shifting demographics and cultural standards were already making many white Americans feel threatened long before Donald Trump played to their fears like a maestro. So where do we go from here? That's what we want to explore in this last episode of this season of Breaking the Vote. We'll go to Italy for a reality check on a democratic country taking a hard right turn that reminds too many people of a dark history. An expert on how democracies thrive joins us to talk about what we can do to make things better. And a bunch of my colleagues here at Vice get together to try to hash it all out ahead of next week's midterms. But first, Alexis Johnson takes us to Pennsylvania, where one candidate is trying to get elected governor by turning voters into Christian soldiers.
Events like this usually aren't a big part of Doug Mastriano's campaign, but neither are TV ads, talking to press, or building relationships with other Republicans. He first built a following online with constant election denialism after Trump's loss in 2020.
I pray for the leaders also in the federal government, God, on the 6th of January, that they will rise up with boldness. You'll bless these letters that President Trump asked me this morning to send to Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy, outlining the fraud in Pennsylvania.
Mastriano is pretty aligned with all the other Trump loyalists across the country running for office this year. He even spent campaign funds to charter buses to the January 6th insurrection. The difference is that Mastriano is running for the governor of Pennsylvania, one of the most powerful seats in the country, because whoever holds it can rewrite the state's voting laws and appoint a Secretary of State who can deny election outcomes. And despite Mastriano's elusive campaign strategies, he seems to have built a devoted fan base.
Why do you think Doug Mastriano would make a good governor for Pennsylvanians specifically?
Because he was right from the get-go. The COVID, the shots, the vaccines, the shutdown, the way they destroyed our economy, Doug would have never done none of that.
And I like that he is just an honest Christian guy. I really believe that I can trust him to do the right thing by Pennsylvanians. He's honest, he's trustworthy, and I believe that he has a lot of values that align with my values.
Mastriano takes the old political cliche of fighting for the soul of the nation pretty literally. He depicts Democrats who support abortion, climate change intervention, or LGBTQ rights as satanic. Even his campaign slogan is just a quote from the Bible.
So the slogan is walk as free people.
Correct.
Why do you resonate with that?
Because that is what our liberties, especially being from Pennsylvania, is founded on. You know, this is the Keystone State. You know, we were founded on things like religious freedom with William Penn, and that resonates with me. And so far, only Doug Mastriano has, fought for that.
There's a name for this type of thinking: Christian nationalism. The belief that America is a Christian nation. and the government should take any step to keep it that way. Even though it's become much more popular in the last few years, this ideology has a long history.
So when it comes to Christian nationalism, how would you describe that?
Some of what we've seen among Christian nationalists who are running for political office is they describe politics as spiritual warfare. They might describe their political campaign as a kind of military battle. So there's this kind of connection between violence and Christianity. Doug Mastriano, for example, went to this Jericho march. Jericho was one of the cities that was part of the Canaanite conquest in the Hebrew Bible. This is literally language about killing people. And we don't know when those metaphors will incite actual violence.
In recent months, there have been several reports of Mastriano's ties with Gab, the anti-Semitic and conspiracy-ridden social network. That's the site where the shooter at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh laid out his plans. And Gab's CEO regularly pushes conspiracies like the Great Replacement Theory.
If he were to win, what's at stake, what's at risk when those kinds of beliefs bleed into policy and how he can really change people's lives?
Mm-hmm. So there's this language of freedom, but at the same time, he wants to limit women's rights. He wants to limit gay and trans rights. He wants to limit how people can vote, right? So he wants to limit voters' rights. And he has wanted to pass even some legislation where the Bible is taught in schools, which is a kind of form of Christian privilege, which would limit other people's religious rights.
Mastriano has rejected the label of Christian nationalist, but other Trump acolytes with similar views have embraced it. There are anti-Trump Republicans who have had enough of GOP nominees mimicking the former president, and they're actively working to make sure candidates like Mastriano lose.
So we're about to meet with a guy named Craig Snyder, who is a longtime member of the GOP here in Pennsylvania, but has been actively working to get Republican voters to vote against Doug Mastriano in the midterms.
We've specifically targeted about 250,000 registered voters, likely voters, people who regularly vote in elections, who are either Republicans or Republican-leaning independent voters, who we believe want to preserve democracy. They don't want what Mastriano represents, and we think they're going to cross over and split tickets. If we can get a reasonable number, and I believe we will, of Republicans to split their tickets in this race, I think we can determine the outcome and make sure that Mastriano is defeated and that Josh Shapiro is the next governor of the state.
Did you ever think in 2022 that you would be actively campaigning for a Democratic governor?
No. I mean, the short answer is no. I thought the Republican Party could be salvaged, could be improved. But when you get to this point where the nominee is somebody as extreme as Mastriano is, not only on election integrity issues, but really across the board, I think you got to take a stand. I say to people all the time, if you get invited to a banquet and they tell you you're going to pick chicken or fish, and you might want pasta, but they're not serving it. So you got to pick one or the other. And in this case, Mastriano is the fish that's rotten and stinks. And you got to pick the chicken. And that's Josh Shapiro.
They don't want to talk about how they want to deem any parent who has a strong opinion about their child's education as domestic terrorists. Yep. Strange times we live in. They don't want to talk about the shutdown. They want you to forget about the COVID mandates, the forced masking of your kids. They don't want to talk about how they did everything they could to blunt our questions into voting integrity.
I think that the Republican Party still doesn't realize how radicalized their base has become under Donald Trump.
Sarah Longwell's job involves regularly polling voters in Pennsylvania.
It's possible that what Doug Mastriano is doing is he doesn't really think he can win a general election, but he thinks he can become kind of a local celebrity, somebody that the base, looks to for leadership. And that's a lot of this Republican Party now. There's people who can own sections of the base by being more and more extreme, and then they can still have political power in a state. It's
possible Mastriano's views are too extreme even for Trump lovers. he's not polling well and hasn't raised much money. But anybody who witnessed Trump's surprise win in Pennsylvania in 2016 knows better than to count Mastriano out. We talked about his lack of kind of public ad campaigns, but how he does attract the base on social media through Facebook. Does that give you any fear? Or are you nervous that this kind of silent base that he's building is going to end up popping up in November?
Hey, look, one of the things that Donald Trump showed us is that the polls are missing a lot of voters. And so it's very hard to predict turnout for a candidate like this. I'm from Pennsylvania. I know that there are voters that exist who would find Doug Mastriano attractive. I would like to think that that is not a majority of voters in Pennsylvania, but there's always this question of, have these people participated in elections before? Are they showing up in polling and just not being sure and wondering if there is this red wave in 2022 that there's going to be all these people that you didn't expect to see turning out and voting for Doug Mastriano.
From Pennsylvania to Rome. When we come back, we head to Italy, where the country's newest far-right leader is freaking out Democratic heads across Europe as she celebrates her win and her fond memories of the country's fascist past.
Miss Meloni, are you trying to bring fascism back to Italy?
This is Breaking the Vote. I'm Todd Zwillich. More than a third of the world's population today lives under authoritarian rule. Just a little over 6% enjoy what you could call full democracy. That's according to The Economist and this year's Democracy Index surveying 167 countries. An authoritarian streak is clearly growing. Here in the US, we've been pretty much downgraded on the world stage. Our democracy, the one we like to hold up as an example of enlightened governance to the world, is in danger of backsliding into something different. But we're not alone. There are dozens of so-called flawed democracies around the world tiptoeing with extremism. For example, Italy. Voters there just elected its first far-right leader since Mussolini was ousted and hung after World War II. Her name is Giorgia Meloni. Matthew Castle covered her rise to power.
Where right now, Giorgia Meloni is holding a rally before this country's election. Meloni is young, she's well-spoken, she's charismatic, and politically, she's very far to the right. She's widely expected to be the next prime minister of this country. Miss Meloni, are you trying to bring fascism back to Italy? Just one question.
I fascisti sono morti tutti. Dove sono I fascisti?
Matthew Castle joins me now. Matthew, so Meloni wins an election, forms a government, takes power in Italy as the first far-right leader since Mussolini. That's a scary sentence. But Italy's gone through like a dozen prime ministers in just the last couple of decades. Their governments almost always end in collapse. So what makes Meloni different here, and what can you tell us about what she was able to tap into that's got her to this moment?
Right, that's a really good question, and it's not a secret that Italian governments, they usually don't last very long. They often end after, some months or a couple years in collapse, and there's a good reason for that. After World War II, Italy came up with a new constitution that was supposed to make it very difficult for a strong man or a strong woman to ever become as powerful as Mussolini was. And it's largely worked. And what we saw when we were reporting in Italy recently is that even for people who oppose Meloni and oppose her views, they find comfort in knowing that it's going to be very, very difficult for her to become the kind of authoritarian leader that people have warned. But at the same time, there's a bit of irony in that system of government that I mentioned that has existed in many places in Europe since the Second World War, which is largely built on coalition building and compromise, which prevents radical change and largely maintains a status quo, is what a lot of people in Europe at the moment and across Western democracies are unhappy with. They want radical change, and they don't see that radical change being proposed by the left or the centrist parties. They see the far right proposing that change. Whether or not Meloni is actually going to be able to, make that change she's promised, that remains to be seen.
So there was clearly a feeling of frustration and desire for change among the Italian people. You've traveled around the world reporting from democracies, autocracies, run the gamut. Is Meloni and the far right's rise to power in Italy, is that an anomaly, or would you say it's part of a larger pattern, a worldwide leaning toward authoritarianism?
Absolutely part of a bigger pattern. And there are countries and regions in the world where authoritarian systems of government have existed for a very long time. But now what we're seeing in Western democracies is an uptick, an increase in authoritarian parties and also authoritarian governments that exist in some countries. One of the reasons, big reason, is that for the past, decade and a half or so, there's been a very, brutal period of brutal austerity. And people are unhappy with that. And now that they are again facing economic crises and soaring inflation and increasing energy, people are again unhappy, and they're not seeing any radical proposals coming from the left, but they are seeing those radical proposals coming from the far right. But the far right knows that in order to make the kind of radical change it's telling people, it's promising people, it's going to need to do things like change the Constitution, stack the courts, gerrymander districts, use the media to spread its propaganda. And it's largely working. The right is on the rise in many countries. And the fear is in Europe that with this winter's looming energy crisis, it's going to exploit that to its advantage even further.
Matthew Castle, thanks so much. Coming up, I sit down with the reporters you've heard throughout this program so we can hash out what next week's midterms mean for the Republic and what all this means for our future. But up next, a renowned expert tells us what Italy's move to the hard right might mean for the rest of the world and how we can defend democracy here at home. Welcome back to Breaking the Vote. With Italy on the verge of installing its first far-right leader since Mussolini, it's clear there's a trend at work. On this show, we've taken you to Hungary, to the Mexico border, to Washington, D.C., and there are a lot of other places lurching to the far right and flirting with authoritarianism. But what's driving this pattern? How does the U.S. fit in? Maybe the biggest question, how do we get out of it? Not for Republicans or Democrats' sake, but for everyone's. Dr. Yascha Mounk is a writer and historian known for his work on democratic crises and the defense of liberal values. His most recent book is The Great Experiment: Why Diverse Democracies Fall Apart and How They Can Endure. I spoke with him about all of this authoritarian inertia and what can be done to stop it. Author and historian Yascha Mounk, thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about the U.S. What's going on in America right now?
I think the right way of understanding this is as an authoritarian populist movement, and those are characterized by people who say, I alone truly represent the people. I can come into government and fix all of the problems that the country has had. And nobody should be able to stand in the way of that. And we've seen in many countries around the world, from Hungary to Turkey to Venezuela, how easily that can allow governments to concentrate power in their own hands and make it very difficult to remove a democratically elected government from office by democratic means.
It's pretty easy, I think, to identify some of the anti-democratic depredations of the right, embracing political violence, undermining elections. Pretty easy to spot if you look for it. But you've also written that the American left is doing things that are undermining democracy as well. What are some of those things?
I think there are two things that I worry about. The first is simply on electoral strategy, right? When you have a two-party system, it's really important that Democrats stand on a message which can actually win. Donald Trump is not that popular when you look at the polls, and yet he came very close to being reelected in 2020, and he may very well win the elections in 2024. And so we have to ask ourselves, why is it that a majority of Americans aren't voting for the Democratic Party? Why is the Democratic Party not able to seize on the extremism and the unpopularity of the Republican Party? And I think part of the answer is that on some important social and cultural issues, the Democratic Party is also out of the mainstream of American public opinion. The second thing I would say is that there are some strands of the left that are very critical of core liberal values like free speech. And that has me somewhat concerned as well. But certainly in America today, the threat from Donald Trump and the MAGA movement is much more serious than those threats from the left.
I don't know if you're a betting man or not, but would you bet on American democracy right now going into 2024?
There's a very serious risk of democracy failing in 2024 or 2028 or sometime after that or sometime in between. But that's not the most likely scenario. Perhaps that's only 20% likelihood. Most likely in one way or another, we will manage to get through this and our democracy will survive. But it also obviously means that we need to take a 20-25% of a chance of a really bad outcome very, very seriously. Because even though it might be more likely than not that American democracy survives, the fact that there is a plausible likelihood of it failing should alarm all of us.
So let's get productive for us. What can we do right now, those of us who participate in politics in one way or the other as Americans, to see our way through to the other side here?
I would say three things. The first is that we need to fight against the structural drivers of the rise of this discontent, of the rise of these populists and authoritarians. That means passing policies which ensure that we have real economic growth that ends up in the pockets of ordinary citizens, that people feel that the state is delivering for them, that they're assured a decent life, that they're optimistic about how the kids are going to do. It means creating a vision for the future that is optimistic, that most citizens, whether they belong to various minority groups or to the historic majority, feel like they will have a secure place in, and other kinds of structural changes. That's number one. Number two is that we should get engaged to defend our democratic institutions, that there are all kinds of things we can do to participate in the political process, and we should seize those. But number three is also very important, I think, and that is that precisely in order to defeat populists at the polls, we have to call out the behavior of these populist leaders. We have to make clear how dangerous they are. But we cannot stop having any kind of empathy for our fellow citizens. Whether you like it or not, a democracy means that you have to build a majority at the polls, that we have to try and convince some of the people who may have voted for Donald Trump in the past that they should change their mind. And that means taking some of their concerns seriously, engaging in real conversations, trying to persuade, trying to put our best foot forward, which involves embracing positions that a majority of Americans can actually relate to. And so let's fight, but let's fight in a smart way that helps to unify the country rather than to polarize it further.
Yascha Mounk, professor and historian, thank you so much for that. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much.
Much more Breaking the Vote ahead, including a visit from our band of reporters to work out everything from extremism and the midterms to 2024 and what another campaign could look like with Donald Trump. But up next, a man who's experienced what it's like to try to enforce ethics on Trumpism talks to us about what the future holds when the rules of government disappear. Welcome back to Breaking the Vote. Enforcing good ethics is a tough job in any organization. Now imagine that your job is to enforce good ethics in the Trump administration. You ever try writing a speeding ticket to Vin Diesel? You get the picture. Walter Schaub did it until he had to walk away from the Office of Government Ethics after just 6 months in 2017. Now Schaub is an ethics watchdog, and he has some thoughts on how contempt for the rules is endangering democracy. Walter Schaub is the former director of the Federal Office of Government Ethics. He's currently a senior fellow at the Project on Government Oversight, otherwise known as POGO. Walter, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So, Walter, we spend a lot of time around here talking about undermining elections, promotion of violence, some of the worst aspects of authoritarian Trumpism. But where do you see the biggest damage now to institutions in America from anti-democratic Trumpism?
You know, I think the biggest damage is to public confidence, which sounds perhaps like an abstract or small thing, but the assault really is on all three branches of government, and it's pretty severe at all levels. So you look at the consequence, it's a public that has less faith in the capacity of democracy to produce a government that represents all of us. And where that's a danger is that it could suppress people's willingness to come out and vote or otherwise participate in government. Unlike a lot of other forms of government, democracy actually depends on kind of an idealistic, optimistic viewpoint of the effectiveness of their government. And when that's taken away, the entire thing can fall into crisis pretty easily.
It makes a lot of sense to cover the big stories of corruption, January 6th and the coup attempt, diverting millions in Secret Service money to your private hotel business. Those are big, sexy news stories. They're corrupt and they make a lot of sense. But, I feel like when we do that, we sort of miss a lot of the more insidious corruption that's bleeding through the system right now. What are we missing?
Yeah, years and years ago in the early 2000s, there was an international group that was doing a review of anti-corruption mechanisms in the U.S., and they had a draft report in which they were going to recommend real concerns about the lack of independence of prosecutors, the fact that federal prosecutors report to political appointees who report to the president. And of course, that's so baked into our system, there wouldn't be much we could do about it. But I remember State Department and the Office of Government Ethics and DOJ and other agencies kind of poo-pooed that and talked them into really watering it down to a point where I looked at the report afterwards and you would have to know what they were referring to even get what they were doing. But then you see Trump weaponizing the Department of Justice and Bill Barr's team looking for ways to prosecute political enemies and refusing to take action to enforce laws against the current president at the time. And even now, when we have a new president, we have a Department of Justice where the jury's out on whether they're going to have the nerve to hold senior federal officials accountable, including the former president, because they have sort of an institutional interest in not rocking the boat and a reluctance to look into things in some cases because it would be embarrassing to DOJ itself. They were culpable. Even Merrick Garland fought against the release of a memo in which the Department of Justice's infamous Office of Legal Counsel wrote a memo to Bill Barr coaching him on how to lie to the public about the Mueller investigation's findings. And obviously, there's great inequality in our legal system, but they didn't think that it would be marshaled in favor of a political candidate or against one. But I don't think we can have confidence that another authoritarian administration wouldn't use DOJ as one of its primary weapons against its opponents.
Well, let me ask you about another institution, the Congress. What's the long-term damage of high-profile members of Congress, people like Kevin McCarthy, Scott Perry, Jim Jordan, some of them household names, in this case, Republicans, who were either witnesses to January 6th, in some cases, even participants in the coup plot, really facing no accountability or even refusing to talk to the January 6th committee?
So I'll have to admit I'm not up to speed on the specific conduct of the individuals you mentioned, but we saw, for instance, Josh Hawley standing out there raising his fist, egging on the terrorists. It colors the investigation because you're going after people who are the ones who burst into the building, the foot soldiers, so to speak. And they themselves are saying they were egged on by the former president. And some of them got tours of the building by members of Congress immediately before the attack. And so it, again, raises questions about how serious you are about going after those responsible for this. And yeah, the damage is incalculable. I can't even begin to put into words how dangerous it is that people who may have, or at least have created the suspicion that they may have participated in some aspect of this attack, are not even not being held accountable, but don't even appear to be under investigation and certainly are not under public questioning. It goes to show the extent to which we're in danger of really losing democracy. And I've often said that I feel like January 6th was the dry run. I think there's a real danger that after the election in 2024 and early 2025, we could see violence on a scale that would make January 6th look like a picnic. And that scares the daylights out of me.
Walter Schaub, Senior Fellow at the Project on Government Oversight. Thanks. I'll be honest, we've covered some pretty heavy stuff on this show. The new use of intimidation and propaganda as political tools, the normalization of violence to secure power, our national drift toward authoritarianism, and the choices that we're making along the way. We're reporting on all this stuff not for any party or policy, but because we're pro-democracy and pro-truth, not pro-pretending like everything is politics as usual. The incredible reporting from our Vice News team has helped shed light on it all, bearing witness and sounding the alarm. So we wanted to end the show by hearing directly from them. I sat down with our political and extremism reporters to figure out what the 2022 midterms could signal for the future of this country. No, I'm not sure if this is group journalism session, group therapy. What's amazing to me, I sit around and I look at all my colleagues, like people who've been in different parts of this campaign all over the country, is like there isn't a single beat that hasn't been touched by this, like, I don't know, this threat to democracy. Like, you're on the extremism beat, you've been in Pennsylvania, you've been at the border. So I was really surprised, Paolo, like you spend a lot of time reporting on immigration and the border, and you went to the border and like blew me away because Latinos, Hispanic Americans voting at the border are like internalizing replacement theory. It's like, it's Nazi shit, it really, and it shocked me.
Yeah, and I think that's a little bit the story of the election too, right? These theories, not like the great replacement theory, that we once thought of it as, being in the fringe. We thought of the Buffalo shooter, Pittsburgh, Escondido, El Paso. We've now seen it slowly become mainstream. We hear J.D. Vance, we hear Blake Masters, we hear all these like white Republicans, and then suddenly you go to the border and you start hearing Latinos and some Latino candidates say the same thing. There's nothing more powerful, and I feel like we've all seen that, than the politics of grievance, right? There's nothing easier than being able to blame the other for something you don't have. And I think that's true with white folks, but I think it's also true we're seeing with Latino voters, right? The moment that you can say, look, I want to be just like them, and those immigrants that are invading my country are taking something away from me.
I mean, Ben, you report on the fringes of all of this because you report on the extreme of the extreme. Mm-hmm. Literally Nazi cells across America, extremism in the military. And here you are with like the political cabal of Vice News. Like you're at the table now, which is weird.
Like when I got into journalism, the idea of an extremism desk didn't exist, nor was this really a beat. And now I think it's, Vice has a great extremism desk, but a lot of publications have them because you need them because it's happening everywhere. I remember seeing stuff about great replacement theory, which has this, convoluted history among neo-Nazis in like chat groups with the base, which is this very hardcore neo-Nazi terror group. And to see that now being used as being name checked on Tucker Carlson, which is the most popular TV show or nightly TV show in America, to me, it was just sort of like this wild moment. And that was literally 3.5 years, I think, from when I first saw it to now seeing it be front and center in American politics.
On the other hand, though, there is the truth of the changing demographics of the United States, which is to say the electorate is changing and has been changing for decades now. What I find interesting about the great replacements theory is that it imputes an intent and motive on a phenomenon that's effectively because America is a great place to come to for many people.
There's different types of this, right? I mean, there's the academic version that used to be the changing demographics, because the initial idea of this is if you populate the country with particularly Hispanic immigrants, it is going to be a big wave for Democrats, right? And of course, when you group people in as Hispanic or whatever you'd like to say, it doesn't look for any variation between people. You go to the border and people say, Tejanos who have been there 2-3 generations, and they're like, oh my God, Hondurans, no. Nicaraguans, no. And then there are people that come from New York and say Hispanics, and like, no. There's gradations, and then at the top of this, you have people who are becoming very conservative. That's actually defeating this idea that if Hispanics come, they will just be Democrats.
I'm not so much worried about the politicians. It's the people, right? This is why they are where they are, because they're affecting so many people. They're changing so many people's minds. They're influencing so many people, and You know, I covered a Trump rally in 2016 when I was in grad school. The people that were there, I just remember that energy and being like completely terrified, and seeing how here we are 6 years later and it's worse is pretty damning to me, I think.
Liz, you've covered several elections, and there have been so many times that a pre-election sort of moral panic. Caravans, I mean, you can go down the list and name them.
Yeah.
The day after Election Day, poof, it's gone, like it never happened. It provided great, super good Fox News, really good internet for a couple of months. I mean, does from what you've seen on the campaign trail, does moral panic over CRT or drag brunch or trans abusive children, like, does that go away on November 9th, or is that kind of thing here to stay?
I don't think it's going to go away, and I think that Donald Trump has really solidified the culture wars in this country. I think that that's a lot of what we're all talking about right now is the idea of one person's way of life offending other people. I think Trump has really injected that into the mainstream. I think that DeSantis has continued that as well. I do think that, we still have a few days before Election Day, and I see the economy factoring into things. I mean, I think that people vote on their wallet a lot of the time.
And to the extent these election deniers kind of come into office, that of course sets up the next election for being really crazy. Because once they take power, they can make decisions and change it. And to your point about how does this feel like covering this election, to me it feels like the scene in Jaws where they've just figured out how big the shark is and they say, we're gonna need a bigger boat. I don't think we have a bigger boat. We've got the boat that we're in, and that's our problem. The story that I've been thinking about most is the investigations into Trump. And I think that you make a really good point, that a lot of what you're seeing out there now in this cycle is not specifically about Trump, but I just got back from Atlanta, where all of the smart lawyers that I know who are following the Fulton County District Attorney's investigation into his attempt to flip the last election are all thinking that it's quite likely he's going to get charged in the months following the midterms, which sets up a really crazy scenario if that happens. And again, you make a good point about not making predictions. But let's just say if that happens, it sets up a scenario where you have the likely nominee of one of the two major parties potentially under indictment heading into the next presidential election, which is just uncharted territory, and we just don't know where that goes.
I mean, people have made predictions about this, though.
Sure.
Lindsey Graham is a pretty famous senator as far as senators goes, probably not as famous as Ted Cruz, but he's pretty famous. And he's predicted violence when this happens. He went on television and said, if Trump's indicted, the mob comes out.
And I'll say this, if there's a prosecution of Donald Trump for mishandling classified information after the Clinton debacle, which you presided over and did a hell of a good job, there'll be riots in the streets.
Is he predicting it, or is he calling for it, though? And that's what's scarier about that as well, is that to even put that out there.
The warning is enough.
That's a signal.
Every election cycle seems to be a new radicalizing event where things are thrown out, become the fodder for really awful behaviors in the future. If you look at something like this, when you're throwing out CRT, you're throwing out things like great replacement theory, I think one of the more ridiculous things I'm noticing is that that's done for political purposes, it's for votes. But I think whoever's thinking and allowing that to happen isn't realizing what down the pipeline that looks like, and how you will see people do pretty crazy political things or political acts of violence based on this stuff that is purely in a boardroom saying we get votes out of this, we're leading the polls. And I think that is something that often isn't being thought about, at least on one side of the aisle.
I mean, I remember you went, Alexis, one time, it was a little while ago now, to find people who were intimidating election workers. We have all these reports, election workers are facing threats, they're fleeing their jobs. You went and called them on the phone.
We were talking to people who had called Fulton County, Georgia election workers, but one guy was in Tennessee, because they had put they had put the guy's number in on OAN, you know? So he felt, you know, not even somebody who lives in this, not let alone county, but state, to call this Georgia election worker and say, hey, you know, we know you're doing something scary and I'm going to come after you, you know? And they had no remorse, even if I read the threat back to them and was like, what did you mean when you said, you know, we're coming after you? And they were like, well, I meant that, you know, A, B, and C. And like, you know, you can't tell me that election was fair, and we know there's fraud, and we know that they were the ones responsible for it. So it was my duty to call them up.
Let me ask you something. Do those people get charged with a crime?
No.
See, this is what I think is like such a huge disconnect.
No accountability.
There's no accountability. And I think that this kind of goes back to you talking about investigations and saying that Fulton County might actually bring charges against Donald Trump. A lot of people feel empowered to keep acting in ways that are illegal or almost illegal, which we are seeing now in Maricopa County in Arizona, with people hanging around ballot drop boxes. And now there's a constitutional legal debate on Twitter about what voter intimidation means, because
with guns, by the way, hanging around with guns.
Post Rittenhouse too, which is to say, like,
all of this stuff, people feel emboldened. And I think that was such an important part of the reporting that you have done about those election workers, is that is still happening.
The fact that those aren't being investigated or prosecuted with alacrity is a problem, right? And these things are a problem in general. I mean, we've had this strain in American politics, the paranoid style of American politics, for a very long time. We have a way of broadcasting this stuff now that we didn't have in the past, in the 1990s. So what I think is different, though, is that the threats versus the existential threat. And I'm on the side of Yasha on this, and it's not an ideological thing in any way. It might be just that I have a kind of sunny disposition about American politics and I have a positive outlook on this, is that we do have very, very robust institutions. I mean, we look at this stuff on a very sort of small level and you say, holy shit, I cannot believe that this is happening, because it is absolutely unique. We've had constitutional crises in the past. I think there's a very noxious strain in American politics, particularly on the Republican side. I just don't think that it's an existential crisis for the country and for democracy. I don't think it's going away.
I am always worried if we're focused a lot on like a loud minority. Like, I don't know if we talk, and there's also always a reaction to this stuff, right? Yeah. Like we saw what happened in Georgia. That was very much a reaction to what else was going on. Like all the black women in that state got all these people to go vote. So I feel like there is always a reaction to this kind of, you know, evil GOP stuff that we see.
Well, and I would come back to something you used to say to me a lot, which is like, the Democrats have focused on trying to make policy that they think might help people, right? Like that happened the last couple of years. If that pays off to some degree and people are able to be convinced by economic and other issues to vote for what is in their material interest versus their ideological interests, there's something there. And I think it comes down to like a messenger as well, which is to say Donald Trump was a really exceptionally gifted messenger who knew how to say what was on his mind, and it registered right here with a whole bunch of people. Like the basics here are, I am very scared about political violence. I think political violence might, and potentially will happen. I also think that, like, you know, black people lived in a fascist society for like a couple hundred years until like the 70s, basically, in this country. So fascism has been here. It can come back again. It's about how people communicate a positive vision of what this place is actually about, or could be about.
Well, I'm glad you guys were all here, but also just like glad that you guys are here to bear witness, which is what we tried to do in the show, and you guys have all done that. That's why we wanted to have you back. So thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Good to see you guys.
Thanks, likewise.
That does it for us here at Breaking the Vote. You can keep up on all of this democracy news with our newsletter. You can sign up at vice.com/breakingthevote, and we'll see you around.
I'm Michael Learmonth, editor-in-chief of Vice News. Too often, traditional news outlets shy away from the real stories and experiences of those living through global conflicts. Not Vice News. Our reporters are on the ground, fearlessly covering the human stories that shape our world. You and millions of others can continue to read, watch, and listen to Vice News for free. but we hope you'll consider making a one-time or ongoing contribution of any size at vice.com/contribute. Every contribution, no matter how big or small, helps support the journalism Vice News brings to you every day. Thank you.